When SHTF, nothing is taken all at once. It happens quietly, not with trucks and soldiers at first, but with language, with announcements, with temporary measures that don't feel dangerous yet. This is the moment most people misunderstand what's happening, because during normal times, ownership feels absolute. If you bought it, earned it, or inherited it, it's yours. That idea is so deeply ingrained that people assume it holds under any circumstances. It doesn't. In a crisis, ownership becomes conditional, not immoral, not evil, just conditional. Governments don't begin by confiscating items. They begin by redefining priorities: stability over freedom, order over fairness, control over consent. And once those priorities shift, everything else follows naturally. This isn't theory. It's a pattern. In every major crisis, wars, blackouts, natural disasters, economic collapses, the same logic appears. Authorities are tasked with managing risk at scale. And risk, from that perspective, isn't about individuals. It's about systems, movement, information, resources, energy. Anything that disrupts system-level control becomes a problem to manage, and management rarely looks like force at first. It looks like rules, temporary restrictions, emergency powers, public cooperation campaigns. Most people comply willingly because compliance feels safer than uncertainty. It feels responsible. It feels like the right thing to do. That's why the earliest phase of confiscation doesn't involve resistance. It involves agreement. People tell themselves the measures are temporary, that they're reasonable, that they only apply to others. By the time reality sets in, the framework is already in place. This is the critical shift to understand. In a crisis, what matters most is not what you own, but how visible, unusual, or disruptive it appears to the system trying to stabilize itself. Governments don't target people. They target outliers. Anything that moves too freely, communicates too independently, consumes too differently, operates outside the expected pattern. That's why confiscation often feels selective rather than universal. It follows signals, not inventories. This chapter isn't about fear. It's about perspective. When SHTF, governments aren't asking, what belongs to whom? They're asking, what creates uncertainty? And uncertainty is treated as a threat long before violence appears. Understanding this early changes how you interpret everything that follows. Restrictions aren't random. They're sequential, predictable, incentive-driven. And once you see the pattern, you stop being surprised by it. That's the purpose of this chapter. Not to tell you what to hide, not to tell you how to resist, but to reset how you think about ownership during collapse. Because the people who struggle the most aren't the unprepared. They're the ones who assume normal rules still apply long after they've already been replaced. In the chapters that follow, we'll break down the first categories that come under control when SHTF. Not as a checklist, but as a way to understand why certain things disappear first. Because once you understand the why, the rest stops feeling chaotic. It starts feeling inevitable. And inevitability is easier to survive than surprise. The first thing governments restrict when SHTF isn't food, it isn't property, it isn't even weapons, it's movement. Because movement equals uncertainty. In stable times, mobility is invisible. People move constantly, commuting, traveling, relocating, and no one thinks twice about it. But during a crisis, movement stops being background noise and starts looking like a problem that needs managing. From the perspective of authorities, unrestricted movement creates chaos. It makes outcomes unpredictable. It breaks containment. It spreads problems faster than they can be measured. So mobility becomes the first variable to tighten. Not all at once, not dramatically, quietly. Curfews are framed as safety measures. Checkpoints are framed as coordination. Fuel limits are framed as fairness. Each restriction feels reasonable on its own, temporary, logical, necessary, and most people comply without hesitation. That compliance is what makes mobility controls effective. Force is rarely required. The social pressure to do the right thing does most of the work. This is why movement restrictions appear early, often before people realize the crisis has fully arrived. Mobility is power. It allows people to leave areas before conditions worsen. It allows people to bypass shortages. It allows people to avoid centralized systems. From a system-level perspective, that freedom creates imbalance, so it's constrained. What's important to understand is that mobility isn't just about vehicles or travel. It's about options, the ability to choose where you are, when you're there, and how long you stay. When that flexibility disappears, dependence increases, and dependence is easier to manage. Historically, governments don't announce that mobility is being seized. They introduce layers. Each layer reduces friction for the system while increasing friction for individuals. At first, movement requires justification, then permission, then documentation. Eventually, movement becomes the exception rather than the norm. Most people don't resist this shift because it doesn't feel like loss at first. It feels like structure, like order returning, like stability being restored. But once mobility is limited, everything else becomes easier to control. Resources can be rationed because people can't bypass distribution points. Information can be shaped because people can't easily compare realities. Compliance increases because alternatives disappear. This is why mobility always comes first. Not because it's valuable to individuals, but because it's dangerous to centralized control. The people most affected by mobility restrictions aren't the reckless or the violent. They're the unusual, those who move differently, those who don't follow expected patterns, those who appear unpredictable. In a crisis, unpredictability attracts attention, and attention leads to intervention. This chapter isn't about escaping restrictions. It's about understanding why they exist. When SHTF, movement stops being a personal freedom and starts being treated as a system variable. Once you recognize that shift, you stop being confused by what comes next. Mobility is restricted not to punish, but to simplify, and simplified systems are easier to control. In the next chapter, we'll look at what gets restricted after movement, something even more powerful and far less visible. Because once people stop moving freely, the next step is controlling what they can say, hear, and share. And that changes everything. After movement is restricted, the next thing that comes under control is communication. Not because people are dangerous when they talk, but because information spreads faster than any response system can handle. In stable times, communication feels harmless. Messages, posts, calls, news updates, it's constant, chaotic, and mostly ignored. But during a crisis, information stops being noise and starts being power. Power to coordinate, power to compare realities, power to challenge official narratives. From a system perspective, uncontrolled communication creates instability. Conflicting reports cause panic. Rumors spread faster than corrections. People act on partial information before authorities can respond. So communication gets managed, not shut down immediately, not silenced outright. Filtered. Official channels are elevated. Unofficial ones are discouraged. Certain language becomes unhelpful, misleading, or dangerous. At first, this feels protective. Most people welcome it. They want clarity. They want reassurance. They want a single version of events they can trust. And when fear is high, simplicity feels like safety. That's how control becomes voluntary. communication restrictions rarely look like bans at first. They look like moderation, rate limits, prioritization, temporary measures meant to reduce panic. But the effect is the same. The range of acceptable information narrows. When that happens, people stop sharing what they see and start repeating what they're told. Not because they're forced, but because deviation feels risky. This is the subtle shift most people miss. Once communication is managed, perception follows. What matters isn't whether information is true or false, it's whether it fits the framework being maintained. Anything outside that framework becomes suspect, regardless of intent. And in a crisis, being suspect attracts attention. That's why communication is always the second thing to tighten. Movement controls bodies. Communication controls minds. Together, they stabilize systems, but at the cost of individual awareness. Another effective communication control is dependency. When people lose access to diverse information, they rely more heavily on centralized updates. That reliance increases trust even when trust isn't deserved. Over time, people stop seeking alternatives because alternatives feel unsafe or unreliable. Silence becomes normal, and silence is easier to manage than noise. This chapter isn't about censorship conspiracies, it's about incentives. During SHTF scenarios, authorities are rewarded for reducing panic, not for preserving open discourse. Clear messaging stabilizes behavior, even if it oversimplifies reality. The danger isn't that communication is restricted. The danger is that people adjust so quickly they forget what open communication felt like. Once that happens, control doesn't need to escalate. It sustains itself. People self-censor. They avoid questions. They wait for instructions. And that waiting becomes a habit. Understanding this pattern matters because communication shapes decision-making. When information channels narrow, options appear to narrow as well, even if they haven't. People feel trapped long before they actually are. In the next chapter, we'll look at what comes under control after communication. Something physical, tangible, and deeply emotional. Because once movement and information are managed, the focus shifts to what people need to survive. And that's when resources start to disappear. After movement is limited and communication is shaped, attention turns to resources. Not because resources are scarce at first, but because perception of scarcity changes behavior faster than reality ever could. Food, water, medical supplies, fuel. In normal times, these are background necessities. People assume availability. They trust distribution systems without thinking about them. But when SHTF, resources stop being commodities and start becoming leverage. From a system perspective, uncontrolled resources create instability. If some people have more than others, or appear to, resentment grows. Panic accelerates. Hoarding becomes visible, and visible imbalance threatens order. So resources get managed, not seized overnight, not confiscated immediately. Standardized. Limits are introduced to ensure fairness. Rationing is framed as temporary. Distribution points are centralized for efficiency. Most people accept this willingly. Scarcity feels frightening and structure feels comforting. When fear rises, people trade autonomy for predictability without realizing they've done it. That's the moment resources stop being personal. They become administrative. What matters most here isn't how much exists. It's how much is seen. Visibility drives intervention. If something appears unevenly distributed, it attracts attention. And attention invites correction. This is why prepared people often feel pressure first. Not because preparation is wrong, but because difference is noticeable. A household consuming differently, a group not lining up, a pattern that doesn't match the new normal. In a crisis, difference reads as risk, so the system smooths it out. This is also where social enforcement begins to replace official action. People watch each other. They report irregularities. They shame behavior that looks selfish, even when it's simply different. Control becomes cultural before it becomes legal. And once that happens, confiscation doesn't need force. It needs consensus. The hardest part for most people to accept is this: resources aren't taken because authorities want them. They're taken because distribution must look equal. Equality calms crowds. Crowds calm systems. Fairness becomes more important than efficiency. And in that trade, personal stockpiles stop being private decisions and start being public problems. This chapter isn't about blaming governments or condemning preparation. It's about understanding incentives. In SHTF scenarios, the fastest way to reduce unrest is to normalize consumption. Anything outside that norm draws scrutiny. That scrutiny doesn't feel hostile at first. It feels procedural, administrative, necessary. By the time people realize what's happening, the framework is already set. Understanding this early matters because it reframes the question. It's not, what do I have? It's, what do I signal? Resources don't disappear all at once. They disappear quietly through policy, pressure, and perception. In the next chapter, we'll look at what follows resource control, something even more foundational. Because once movement, communication, and supplies are managed, the system turns to what powers everything else: energy. And when energy is centralized, dependence becomes unavoidable. Once movement, communication, and resources are managed, control shifts to something quieter, but more powerful than all three: energy, electricity, fuel, heat, power generation. Energy isn't just a utility. It's the invisible backbone of modern life. Almost everything people rely on: food distribution, communication, transportation, medical care, depends on it. That's why energy is never allowed to remain decentralized during a crisis. From a system perspective, uncontrolled energy creates unpredictability. It allows people to operate independently. It lets some continue functioning while others can't. And uneven functionality creates tension. So energy gets centralized, not framed as seizure, framed as prioritization. Critical services first, emergency operations first. Temporary restrictions for everyone else? Most people accept this immediately. Energy outages feel normal during emergencies. Rolling blackouts feel fair. Conservation messaging feels responsible. And once people adapt to reduced access, expectations reset. This is where dependence deepens. When energy becomes unreliable, people reorganize their behavior around availability windows. They wait for power. They plan around outages. They accept disruption as normal. That acceptance is crucial, because once energy access is conditional, everything tied to it becomes conditional too. Communication slows, food spoils, mobility decreases, comfort disappears. And with each loss, people rely more heavily on centralized solutions. Energy control doesn't need enforcement. It uses inconvenience. Most people don't resist reduced access to power. They adapt. They ration mentally. They lower expectations. And in doing so, they surrender leverage without realizing it. Another important shift happens here. Energy control creates compliance through relief. When power returns, even briefly, it feels like progress. Like stability is returning. People associate centralized control with improvement, even if conditions are worse than before. That psychological effect is powerful. It turns dependence into gratitude. This is why energy restrictions often last longer than promised. Not because authorities intend to deceive, but because restoring full access removes a tool that simplifies management. Limited energy creates predictable behavior. predictability reduces risk. From a system perspective, that trade makes sense. This chapter isn't about generators or alternatives. It's about recognizing how energy shapes autonomy. When energy access narrows, options narrow with it. People stop improvising and start waiting. Waiting becomes normal. And once waiting becomes normal, control doesn't feel like control anymore. It feels like reality. Understanding this pattern matters because energy restrictions don't announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, wrapped in practicality. And once they're in place, reversing them is difficult. Not because of force, but because everyone has already adjusted. In the next chapter, we'll look at what comes after energy. Something less obvious, but deeply personal. Because once movement, communication, resources, and power are managed, the final thing to erode is what allows people to operate independently at all. Privacy. And when privacy fades, compliance becomes automatic. Privacy isn't usually taken first. It disappears last, after people stop noticing it's gone. When SHTF, privacy doesn't vanish through force, it erodes through trade-offs. Small ones, reasonable ones, the kind most people agree to without hesitation. For safety, for efficiency, for coordination. At first, nothing feels intrusive. Data is collected to understand the situation. Tracking is introduced to reduce risk. Verification becomes necessary to ensure fairness. Each step feels logical, and each step narrows the space where individuals can operate unseen. Privacy matters because it protects independence. It allows people to make decisions without scrutiny. It gives room for adaptation. When privacy fades, behavior becomes performative. People act not on judgment, but on what looks acceptable. That shift happens quietly. Once movement is restricted, communication filtered, resources standardized, and energy centralized, privacy becomes the final variable to manage. From a system perspective, privacy creates blind spots. Blind spots create uncertainty, and uncertainty is the enemy of control. So privacy gets reframed, not as a right, but as a risk. Unmonitored behavior is labeled unsafe. Unverified activity becomes suspicious. Unrecorded decisions feel irresponsible. Most people accept this reframing because they're tired. They want stability. They want reassurance that someone is handling things. And when stress is high, oversight feels comforting. This is where compliance becomes automatic. People begin to self-regulate. They avoid actions that might look strange. They reduce questions. They conform to visible norms. Not because they're forced, but because deviation attracts attention. Attention becomes the real deterrent. Privacy doesn't disappear because it's removed. It disappears because it's no longer used. People stop expecting it. Once that happens, oversight doesn't need to expand. It maintains itself. Social pressure fills the gaps where enforcement once lived. This is why privacy is the most fragile element in any crisis. You can restore movement, you can reopen communication, you can resupply resources, you can re-energize systems. But once people internalize observation, privacy doesn't fully return. Another important shift occurs here. Identity replaces individuality. People become profiles. Patterns replace context. Behavior is evaluated statistically, not personally. From a system standpoint, this simplifies management. From an individual standpoint, it removes nuance. And when nuance disappears, flexibility disappears with it. This chapter isn't about surveillance technology or specific policies. It's about understanding the psychological exchange that happens under pressure. People trade privacy for perceived safety because safety feels immediate. Privacy feels abstract. And in a crisis, abstract values lose to concrete fears. But that trade has consequences. When privacy erodes, independence erodes. When independence erodes, compliance doesn't need to be enforced. It becomes habitual. That's the final stage. Not control through power, control through normalization. In the final chapter, we'll bring everything together. Because once movement, communication, resources, energy, and privacy are managed, the question isn't what gets taken next. It's what remains. And understanding that distinction is what separates people who feel trapped from those who stay clear-headed when everything changes.